Chapter 14. Crespi looked exhausted, but he had that happy, glazed look that told Church things couldn't have gone better. They walked through the lab, past Stockdale, meticulously cleaning the equipment. It was still another hour until dawn, when the station's light would cycle up to full power. And if we can use one more specimen, I can get 16 different models on Requad. No problem. Church struggled to get his lab coat on as Crespi babbled, full of ideas and propositions. The younger scientist seemed to have that boundless, wired energy that came from too little sleep. Church smiled tiredly. "We'll start on the next shift, if you like." Crespi smiled. "Excellent, excellent. The implications of this project are mind-numbingly significant, Doctor." Church fixed him with a serious gaze. "I quite agree. And if I may say so, it takes a special kind of scientist to appreciate that." Crespi smiled and nodded shortly, accepting the compliment without fluster, and without seeing it for what it is. "Why don't you go and get some rest, eh? You look all done in." Crespi shrugged, grinning. "Right, though I don't know if I'll be able to sleep. See you in 8 hours." He veered down the corridor back towards his quarters, and Church went towards his own. His room was located next to one of the smaller, unused labs on the station's industrial level. It was quieter there, more private, and he liked the feeling that he was the only man alive down there. He took the lift down and walked to his quarters, yawning. He was bone-weary, too old to be staying up all night. Not that his body couldn't function, but his mind grew distant, hazy. In spite of the exhaustion, he knew it would be a while before sleep came. He'd been suffering a mild insomnia for several months, perhaps from the excitement of his research. He'd made quite a few breakthroughs since he started the experiments, and felt that he was coming closer to his quest with each day. Did Crespi understand? That seemed to be the question, didn't it? False flattery aside, the man was quite capable, if somewhat limited. There was no reason for Church to dismiss him, certainly. He seemed to grasp many of the minute details that previous assistants had not. But would it be enough? Did he dare to hope? "Sleep now." He entered the dark room and went to the small kitchen area where he kept a few assorted drugs, sleep enhancers, cavitrine pills and the like. He tapped a glass of water and downed 2 of the sleeping tablets before heading back into the dim bedroom. Church removed his shoes and glasses, then lay back to wait for the pills to kick in. Funny how seeing the drone die had stirred up such emotion. He usually felt something like regret, even pity, but the feelings that had rushed over him earlier had been intensely unhappy ones, bitterly nostalgic. He didn't like to think of the hell. Time that his family had stopped on that small moon. It was pointless and painful. But there were times he couldn't help it, couldn't hold back the flood of memories that he'd worked so hard to dam. Most had faded with time, the emotions muted, the times and chronology misplaced. Church closed his eyes, helpless to stop himself as the sleep tablets rushed through his system. There were some things he'd never forget. The aliens jerked and pulled the stumbling humans through the low brush of Eden, away from the Genesis station and their ship. "Paul? Paul!" His mother was somewhere ahead of him, couldn't see that he was still there. "Okay," he shouted, though he felt anything but okay. The monster that held him did so with incredible strength. His arms were already bruised and aching, and he knew, with no trace of doubt, that they were all being taken to their deaths. Why haven't they killed us already? Why would they? A sudden, sick dread filled him. Those stories they'd heard back on that military station. The aliens used humans for more than food. Used them for... Paul struggled harder against the merciless claws, but the creature gripped tighter, hissing. Small rivulets of blood ran down his arms as the talons pierced his skin. Ahead, a huge rock, overgrown with weeds and green moss, easily as big as their ship. Bigger. As they got closer, Paul could see that it wasn't a rock at all. And the smell. It was the source of the fetid scent that he'd noticed earlier, an odour of decay, of mould, and a strange, sour musk like nothing he'd ever smelled before. It was of rotten flesh, dying sweat, of boiling vomit and flat, poisonous chemicals. He knew he'd never be able to describe it to someone who didn't already know it, and he realised at the same time that he probably wouldn't survive to. They hadn't seen the hive when they'd landed because of the vegetation all over. A stupid, possibly fatal mistake. Because the drones had seen them, probably watching from their rancid nest, hissing and shrieking in mad pleasure. "Everybody try and stay calm. They're not going to kill us right away. We've still got..." His father's voice was cut off as the creature that carried him shoved him towards an opening at the base of the hive, a dark, ragged hole. One by one, Paul's family and friends were pushed through the opening, followed and led by the hissing drones. Paul was last, and he could hear the choked moans of the others as the stench hit him. It was beyond stench, a foul miasma that raped his lungs and burned his eyes and throat. He tried to breathe shallowly, through his mouth, but the air tasted almost as brutal as it smelled. He heard the sound of someone throwing up, Louise Clark, and he thought insanely that the creatures would stop, let her clean herself up. No. That was the thought of the human mind, a civilized gesture that meant less than nothing in this place. He had to stop, try to see past his panic, and accept that this was happening. To do less was to invite insanity. The drone dragging him along caught up to the rest, where he could see their pallid faces in the dim, murky light, contorted with terror and pain. Louise was drenched in vomit and drew in deep, ragged breaths, the bile still trickling from her chin. The journey probably only lasted a minute or so, but it felt like forever, a twisted, terrifying jaunt through a haunted cavern. Strange, misshapen ropes of dark secretion hung from the walls, the bizarre symmetry as alien as the creatures themselves. The walls had hollow places, pits, from which black, grinning heads peered out to study the new arrivals, cluttering in flashes of shining, wet teeth. They were brought to some kind of open chamber and dumped unceremoniously on the ground, the high walls stretching up into the stinking darkness like a cathedral of bones. His parents crowded around him, as Rebecca's did for her, as if they could protect their children in this place, keep them from harm. Judith stepped up to Paul's father. "Can you defend us?" His voice was shaky and frightened. Even she seemed pale in the gloom, the only light filtered through webbed cracks high above. "If they attack." Lucian Church had started to cry. "They have! Don't you see that? Can't you kill them?" Judith shook her head. "I will defend you to the best of my abilities, but I probably won't cause any damage before they stop me." The drones had pulled back for a moment, but now they came closer, crept forward with their arms outstretched. It was hopeless. There were too many of them. Paul spun around wildly, frantic for a way out, but there was none. Cracks and fissures high above seemed to mock them, casting faint, sweet light from Eden so far away. There was only murk and hissing monsters, and the promise of impregnation, their bodies used to incubate the alien young. A cruel, living torture before death. And that horrible, horrible stink. If they made it out of this, he'd never forget it, or what it felt like knowing that hope was sometimes all one had. Never. He slept, dreaming that the sun had died, casting an eternal darkness over all the worlds that man had ever known.